It has been estimated that 95% of all manufactured goods rely on some form of chemical process. So think about it, all the stuff that you have around you has been created with the help of the chemical industry. And that is why it's sometimes called the industry of industries. So I think it's safe to say that the industry has had a profound effect on everyone in both good and in bad ways. So speaking specifically about the bad ways, when we at ChemSec tested our blood for PFAS chemicals, most of us had levels that were above the recommended threshold. And it's not only us. In fact, all of you watching this most certainly have a toxic chemicals in your bodies. Several studies have found toxic chemicals in newborn babies, and they travel from the mother to the fetus via the umbilical cord. So it's our mission, ChemSec's mission, to change all this, of course. But when we set out to write this new report about chemicals, we said, let's not write this report for people who know all this already. Let's not preach to the choir with this report, we said. So instead, we decided to write a report for someone who does not care much about the health effects of hazardous chemicals. So we wanted to write it for someone who cares about the money side of the issue, someone who is under pressure to deliver good results with its shareholders. So therefore, we wrote the report for the board, for these guys. And as we started to research, we uncovered that there are several very strong financial incentives already in place for chemical companies to start phasing out hazardous chemicals and move towards safer alternatives. So that is why we are convinced that we have something very interesting here for the board in this report. But of course, we also wrote the report for other people, such as the forward-looking middle manager at a chemical company. We know several of those, who needs arguments to build a convincing pitch and convince the board to make the smart business choice and switch to safer chemicals. And of course, we wrote it for the institutional investor, which my colleague Patrik Witkowsky will talk more about right now. So welcome, Patrik.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, so since the report, A Profitable Detox, it builds on the work of the investor initiative on hazardous chemicals. Let me first just say a few words about that, and then I'll come to the report itself. So the IIHC is an investor network with more than 60 members with an aggregated $12 trillion of assets under management or advice. And here you can see the active members of the initiative, which are, so they are continuously engaging with the world's largest chemical producers. And we at ChemSec, we coordinate this initiative and provide expertise. So we can take the next slide. So the IIHC have three key asks of the chemical industry. So the first is to increase transparency. The second is to publish a time-bound phase-out plan of products that are or contain persistent chemicals. And then the third is to develop safe alternatives for hazardous chemicals. And we can take the next slide. So the report it attempts to outline the business case for these three asks. So in other words, it is not a report about the systemic or economy-wide consequences of hazardous chemicals. Rather, it is about the mid to long-term market incentives for a profit-seeking chemical company to take action. And two caveats is that even though the main subjects of the report are chemical companies, the incentives largely applies to all sectors that use a lot of chemicals. And secondly, the report argues on a generic level. So obviously the incentives apply differently to different companies, depending on their product portfolio, customer base, etc. But it is meant to serve as a starting point for a discussion about, big picture strategies for chemical companies. And we can take the next slide. So first ask increase transparency. So first incentive is stay ahead of regulation. So over the last few years, we've witnessed regulators worldwide forcing companies to disclose more information about their chemicals management. And the main effort directed at this is the EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSRD. And there's really no indication that this trend will die off. So by proactively disclosing more information, companies can avoid these messy and often costly last-minute data gatherings, as well as the risk of fines or penalties for non-disclosure. Second incentive, transparency builds trust with stakeholders. So chemical companies constantly struggle with building trust with their stakeholders, be it investors, customers, regulators, employees, etc. So in the report, we argue that there is no better way of building trust with stakeholders than by being open about what is being produced in the plants and acknowledge the risks that exist. And then third incentive, efficiency and innovation. So in the report, we point to how increased transparency can drive down cost and boost innovation in a number of ways. So, for example, by enabling more collaboration with smaller companies, by making it easier for them to understand the company's challenges and aims. And we can take the next slide. So a good example here is Saudi Arabian petrochemical company SABIC. So here's a screenshot from their latest integrated report, and SABIC is just very open about what they're producing, the production volumes, their product portfolio, and so on. So it's really something that I'd advise others to have a look at. And we can take the next slide. Phase out persistent chemicals. So incentive one, again, stay ahead of regulation. So we're witnessing a regulatory crackdown on PFAS, which is a group of persistent chemicals. So this is primarily in the EU, where there's a universal restriction of PFAS on the table, but also in the US. Most states have now enacted policies in response to the PFAS issue. But we're also seeing regulatory moves in other parts of the world, so New Zealand, Japan, Canada, and so on. So in the report, we detail how some of the world's largest chemical companies, as a response to this, are already moving out of PFAS, and why this is a very rational strategy. Second incentive, avoid costly and resource draining litigation. So the first PFAS lawsuit was filed in the late 1990s by attorney Robert Billett against DuPont for contamination of a farm in West Virginia. And this is the case covered in the movie Dark Waters. So since then, over 10,000 PFAS complaints have been filed against hundreds of companies, resulting in $17 billion in negotiated settlements. The biggest of which hit 3M, who last year agreed to a settlement of over $10 billion with a group of US public water suppliers. So that's a figure that exceeded the company's profits that same year. And these lawsuits keep rising, as we show in the report, and they're also spreading to Europe. And what's also worth noting here is that a lot of insurers are now explicitly excluding PFAS from their policies because they see it as what's sometimes been referred to as the next asbestos. So a lot of the legal fees and settlements will have to be shouldered by the companies themselves. So it's very risky today to, for example, build a new plant producing or using a lot of PFAS. And then the third incentive here is reduced costs linked to emissions and waste management. And today, there are no effective solutions for properly managing the byproducts of PFAS production. And PFAS just keep accumulating everywhere around us. So this is really a ticking time bomb. So we speculate in the report that it is likely, though of course we cannot say for sure, but that the market price for PFAS products will decrease in the coming years as disposal costs rise. And this will squeeze producers' margins and the profit opportunities associated with PFAS chemistry or fluorochemistry. And we can take the next slide. So a good example here is 3M, who in 2022 just announced that they would exit all PFAS manufacturing by the end of 2025. So we believe that other companies should follow suit. We can take the next slide. So develop safer alternative. Incentive 1, again, stay ahead of regulation. So legislation is being tightened for chemicals generally, and while some companies might wish that this trend will end, we argue that it is quite improbable given the increasing understanding of all the problems linked to hazardous chemicals, so cancer, neurological problems, reduced fertility rates, and so on. So companies should instead acknowledge the regulatory writing on the wall and invest heavily in safer solutions. Second incentive here is to take the lead in a rapidly evolving industry landscape. So the chemical sector has historically been very conservative, and over the last decades not really seen much breakthrough innovation. But as we point out in the report, there are a number of trends that are currently really transforming the global chemical industry. And this incentivizes companies to distinguish themselves from their competitors in different ways. So one smart way of doing this is to develop a broad portfolio of safer products. And then third incentive, address a shifting and untapped demand. So in the report, we point to polls and studies showing that people are willing to pay quite significant premiums for products that are free from hazardous chemicals. And this is especially the case for younger generations. So we believe that there's both a shifting and already existing untapped demand for safer solutions that are open to grab for frontrunner companies. And we can take the next slide. So a good example here, not a perfect example, but a good example is Lanxess. So they have a policy in place not to develop or market new end products containing more than a very small amount of substances that have the characteristics of a substance of very high concern, so an SVHC. So we believe that this is a very good policy to have in place. Now we can take the next slide. Key takeaway from the report, in one sentence, safer chemistry makes financial sense.
Thank you, Patrik. And with that, we hand over to Rachel Crossley from BMP Paribas.
Thank you very much, Peter and Patrik. Thank you for the invitation to join you today. First of all, I'd like to start with a big congratulations for ChemSec on producing what I think is an excellent report. It's timely, it's comprehensive, and I think it does an excellent job of rounding up the really compelling evidence for the need to transition to safe and sustainable chemistry. So I was just going to run through, I posed myself 4 questions that I think maybe our audience may be asking themselves as well, and I'm going to answer those as well. to give some perspectives from an institutional investor, from ourselves, BMP Paribas Asset Management, on this report. We're a member of the investor initiative on hazardous chemicals that Patrik outlined at the beginning. And we manage 576 billion euros in assets currently. So we have, if you can move to the next slide, please, Peter. We are an investor, an institutional investor that has a long time commitment to sustainability. And that's because we believe, and it's fairly self-evident, I would have thought, that sustainable investment is critical to delivering sustainable economies in the long term. And as a broadly diversified investor, that is one that invests across all sectors in both developed and emerging economies, our portfolios are exposed to global systemic risks that then affect our ability to deliver long-term returns to our clients. And systemic risks are those that are generated or imposed by one sector that then have a big impact on many other sectors, the wider economy and society. And the systemic risks in our view are things like climate change, nature loss, declining public health, inequality, and others. And as the chemical sector contributes heavily to several of these interlinked long-term global systemic risks, we believe it's our fiduciary duty to try to tackle them. And the science that we rely on here is the Stockholm Resilience Institute and the Planetary Boundaries research that illustrates that we've now exceeded 7 actually of the planetary boundaries, including those for novel entities, which are chemicals, and also the geochemical flows, potassium and nitrogen too. So we understand and believe that there's a real need to tackle hazardous chemical risk. We believe it is a material risk. And so what we need is comprehensive corporate reporting information from companies to be able to differentiate between them and allocate capital accordingly. Next slide, please, Peter. So yes, flipping this on its head to show it graphically, what we're aiming to do is to encourage and stand behind a transition to safe and sustainable chemistry by design, so that over time and as quickly as possible, we move to green and sustainable chemicals being the dominant products on the market and phasing out those chemicals of concern. So that's what our goal is, to help the companies that we invest in transform their business models, and increasingly over time have our capital invested in those companies that are producing safe and sustainable chemicals. Next slide, please, Peter. So the next question I asked myself was, is it the case that the issues surrounding hazardous chemicals are rising up the investor agenda? Yes, I think is the answer to that question as well. We have the evidence of the number of investors that are involved in the IIHC that Patrik's already discussed, but also very importantly in our sector, we rely a lot on research produced by investment banks, and we're seeing an increasing number of these reports coming out that are trying to understand and then articulate to us as investors, the ones that make the decisions about how to allocate capital. They're increasingly showing and differentiating between companies and the risks and how exposed they are to hazardous chemical production risks or use risks. And then there's also individual investors that are producing these kinds of reports, as well as other NGOs. So the number of these reports, the comprehensiveness and quality of them is also increasing. So I think that's a demonstration that the investor community is seeing more of this information and therefore very likely acting on it. If we can go to the next slide, please. So then the question has to be, I think, are the asks of the IIHC still the right ones? And would I agree that ChemSec has made strong arguments that companies should respond to them? I think absolutely yes. From our perspective, we need the increased transparency in order to differentiate between leaders and laggards. And without comprehensive and comparable data, we can't do that. So our message to regulators particularly is that it's essential that this disclosure is mandated, both in terms of production and use of hazardous chemicals. So we're starting to see that in Europe, but we'd like to see that globally. Obviously, without this information, we can't allocate our clients' capital to different types of funds. For those familiar with the investment world, these are called Article 9 or Article 8 funds that are more sort of sustainability orientated. And we need this information to determine which companies are suitable for which types of funds. And then also, of course, the companies themselves need our capital to support them to transition. So we need information in order to make those investment decisions. Is it right that ChemSec should be calling for the phase out of persistent chemicals? Absolutely. As in many other sustainability areas, companies need to make commitments to move away from products and practices that have the negative impacts on the environment or human health, society more broadly, to those that have fewer or none. And so in order to do that in the chemical sector, that looks like, in our view, a commitment to phase out the most hazardous chemicals and transition to safer alternatives. And of course, that last step of transitioning can't happen without investment in innovation. So again, we're encouraging companies to put more money into innovation, to R&D, to making use of all the databases that now exist from ChemSec and others on safer alternatives, through the responsible deployment of AI, for example, to identify alternatives and chemicals that are eventually safe and sustainable by design. And if we can go to the next slide, please, Peter. So the final question I asked myself is, over and above IHC and the work that we're doing through that initiative, is additional investor action needed? And I think absolutely yes, or not just investor action, but actually action by other stakeholders. One thing investors can do is to press for a consistent application of a very important tool that a lot of companies use, which is highlighted in the report from the World Business Council on Sustainable Development. Their PSA framework is widely used, but at the moment it's not consistently applied by companies, and there's no verification associated with it. There's also other issues, we believe, so that's something that we think investors can help to iron out some of those concerns. We are also all awaiting from next year, the new reports under the CSRD regulation, the ESRS aligned reports, and it is possible in those reports for chemical companies to use commercial confidentiality arguments to not disclose certain information. So we urge investors to look at those reports carefully and to challenge companies if it seems that they are using that argument inappropriately, because we do need to see that kind of disclosure. And even though PFAS are not named as one of the classes of chemicals that need to be included in the scope of those reports, we think it's very important that they are, and companies should voluntarily provide that information, because many investors consider it important and material for the reasons that this report sets out. The customers, obviously, of chemical producers have a pivotal role to play in demanding safer and sustainable chemicals. So investors can engage and are engaging with many other companies in the value chain. And it's important that investors ask those companies to publish time-bound targets to phase out PFAS and other hazardous chemicals, and that all plays into the value chain. And then finally, very much urge investors and companies to get involved in the process that's ongoing now to determine the detailed targets and implementation plans for the global framework on chemicals that was agreed in September last year. This is going to shape delivery and the industry up to 2030 and beyond. So there are opportunities to get involved with that, and strongly encourage investors to look into that. So overall, congratulations again to ChemSec. I commend this report to everybody, and hope you find that these recommendations, mine and ChemSec's recommendations, are helpful in your work. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And if anyone's looking for the report, I could just say that you can obviously find it on our website, but we will also share it in an email along with the recording and the slides after this webinar is done. So we have a couple of minutes left. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here so people can see you better. Let me see if I can. So here you go. Patrik, can I ask you a question? So, one of the big things that the report argues for is that increased transparency. That's one of the big things, and that will, that we can know what chemical producers are producing. But how can a chemical producer gain from that, really? Wouldn't that just leave them open for targeting for, people who want to criticize them?
Yeah, so in the report, we outlined 3 key incentives. So those were the ones I mentioned, positive things that come out of being more transparent. But on your question there, yeah, will other companies be able to know more about what you're doing? So we don't think companies should explain in detail, the ingredients in different products. So we're not asking for more disclosure on a product level, but we're asking for more disclosure on a company-wide level. So we would like companies to explain production volume, share of revenue of different chemicals on an aggregated company level. So, that wouldn't, make it easier for other companies. Other companies wouldn't be able to reverse engineer different products based on that information. And then, as we point out in the report, we take a couple of examples of companies that are already quite open. So I mentioned Sabic there, but there are others as well. And, they're doing very good, and they are a good practice to follow.
All right. Thank you. So, Rachel, I have a question here for you. Are there any indicators that specifically for knowing hazardous substances in use today for investors to make decisions?
Well, this is a problem. Unfortunately, not really. There are the handful of companies that Patrik has mentioned that voluntarily disclose the volumes of hazardous chemicals they produce, and sometimes the revenues associated with those. But they're few and far between, and there are, unless and until we get that level of disclosure from the industry, that's why investors are struggling, because we can't differentiate between companies that have the larger or the smaller risks associated with hazardous chemicals, or even the opportunities, those that are shifting more rapidly. So it's very difficult for us currently to take that kind of information into account. So yeah, that's why we're calling for either comprehensive voluntary disclosure, or really ideally to create a level playing field for mandatory disclosure.
All right. Thanks very much for that nice ending speech, Rachel, and thanks for joining us on this webinar. And thanks to all of you who've been watching us. Remember to sign up for our newsletter and follow us on social media to get all the latest notifications of what will happen, new webinars, etc. And thank you, Patrik, for presenting the report also in a little bit of a detail here. So I hope to see you again next time, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.